much, Sheriff. Our speaker tonight sprung up in Illinois, and he was talking to Abraham Lincoln one day, and he says, "Go west. Go west, young man." Now, some people think Horace Greeley said that. Oh, Abe Lincoln told that to our speaker. He said, "Go west, young man." So he came west. Well, he did bring his family with him, and they came out in the Oklahoma City oil field, not Oklahoma City.
As far as the state line.
All right. They came over into a newly developed pool because his father was a little bit interested in the oil business. They came into the newly developed Glen Pool over around Cushing, Drumright, over in that area. And they lived in a number of places around Oklahoma, moved up into Kansas when they started some of the, when some of those pools were opened up, their shallow pools, including the ones that made Alf Landon a millionaire. He said one time that if you had 100 of those, just pumping 10 barrels a day, you got a lot of oil. And our speaker lived around a number of oil towns. He went through that sort of thing, which is still a rather basic part of their Oklahoma heritage, in addition to agriculture and livestock. Obviously, the petroleum industry is a very important part. And they finally settled down at Okmulgee. He went to high school there, finished high school, started working on the local newspaper. He couldn't wait to get into the newspaper business. And worked there a while, and then he decided he needed a little bit more education. He went over to then Oklahoma A&M, and he needed to make some pretty good grades, so he married the president's daughter. That helped a little bit, but at the same time, there he learned a whole lot about the newspaper business from that standpoint, the college viewpoint. But he made a rather serious business out of that, and then he went back, and he has been on a number of different newspapers in the state, including some 15 or so years on with the Oklahoma Publishing Company, and I could make him feel a little bad there to say one time that when I was city editor of the Oklahoma, and he was one of my reporters. But I'll tell you something else. Right in that specific time, with the late Lawrence Thompson, who just died this week, Lawrence Scoop Thompson died down at Miami. Irvin and Scoop went out largely with Irvin's knowledge of what was going on in state government and everything, uncovered what would have been one of the biggest stories ever developed in this state, and we gave the information over to the then county attorney, and he blew it when they tried the man. Right? And blew it. This involved a governor of the state of Oklahoma, and we had him cold. And our then county attorney blew the thing. Okay, so that happens. All right, so there for a number of years, Irvin was very intimately concerned with state government. He covered it. Then for a number of years after that, he was still interested in it. He was on the Oklahoma City Zoning Commission. He was on the State Capital Improvement Commission. If you think it's pretty good now to go out there where they're on Northeast 23rd, there where they depressed it, that was his idea. He's the one who thought that up, to allow all the different avenues of traffic to go around that complex. He's done many things like that. He also has an absorbing interest in Oklahoma history. His book, The 46th Star, is an excellent book, and any of you historians, I don't think that you can find anything in there you could quibble about, because this guy is one of the most conscientious researchers you've ever seen in your life. And I think that's about far enough. He's going to tell us a little bit about the removal, the actual true story of how the capital got moved from Guthrie to Oklahoma City, and there are more old wives' tales about that than almost anything there since Carrie Nation dropped her hatchet at Kiowa, Kansas. On a beer barrel, not whiskey. And there's a little bit of that. Of course, I've been an associate of his for a long time, a friend of his, I hope. and a little bit about this that I know from other sources. For instance, he'll mention somewhere in there that one fellow who made the trip from Oklahoma City to Guthrie the night that some activities went on was the late Luther Harrison. Luther told me years ago his part in that, and he didn't know what was going on. He went along for the ride. 1921, 23, when I was living at Walters, the city manager there was a guy named W.B. Anthony. You'll hear about Big Bill Anthony from Irving. And he told me that every time I'd see him on the street. In fact, I had to run to keep him from telling me the story. So I give you Irvin Hurst.
At Stillwater. Now it happens that I started newspapering 50 years ago last October, so that's a half a century. And it happens that 2 weeks from today, which will be March the 16th, I first set foot on Oklahoma soil at Cushing on March 16th, 1913. Cushing then was the center of activity of what became the great Cushing Drumright oil field. It's true I came from Illinois, but I was born in Indiana, and Illinois was merely a way station on the way. But the one thing I told the students at Stillwater Tuesday, I tell you now, for anybody who's interested in newspapering. First, when you lose your sense of curiosity, get out. From time to time, after I left 4th and Broadway to go with New York Life 30 years ago, some of my former colleagues with a air of superiority say, well, I can't understand why you'd quit the newspaper business to go into life insurance. Well, I said, for one thing, I didn't quit it. But for another, my income taxes have been double what my salary used to be, and that would be one damn good reason for making a change. Number two, I told those kids that it doesn't matter how advanced journalism becomes in production. You still have to get back to the basic ingredients, and one of them is accuracy. I got so tired a few months ago of picking up the paper and seeing that there was a fight between he and his grandmother, or that went around the corner and threw he and his girlfriend out and like, that I wrote my friend Ed Montgomery, who was then sitting in as city editor, and by the way, I was city editor of the Oklahoma a long time before Roy was. But I wrote my friend Ed Montgomery, who was city editor, and I said, between you and I can't stand these between he and his grandmother heirs. For Christ's sake, do something about it. So you haven't seen any of them recently. They got that. So accuracy was that, and the other was a matter of good grammar. But to get on with the story of the removal of capital, many people apparently go on the theory that Charlie Haskell, who happened, by the way, to be a teetotaler, that Charlie Haskell got up one morning with a hangover and decided to move the capital to Oklahoma City, and that was it. Nothing is farther from the truth. And on a previous occasion, when I told you how Oklahoma became a state, I pointed out that the opening of the so-called unassigned lands on April 22nd, 1889, resulted from a rider tacked on to an Indian appropriation bill right in the closing days of the Congress, and President Grover Cleveland, who was going out at the end of his first term, either had to veto the appropriation bill, which had led to another massacre at Wounded Knee, or he had to approve it with the rider. So he approved the bill. Then it became the responsibility of Benjamin Harrison, who became president on March the 4th, 1889, to issue a proclamation for the opening, which came on April the 22nd. Now again, let me point out to you that we opened only 6 central counties, Payne County, Logan County, Oklahoma, Canadian, Cleveland, and Kingfisher. And yet there was no form of organized government because the Congress, then as now, you know, those guys haven't got around to appropriating money for the fiscal year, which began July the 1st last year. You realize that in Washington? Practically every activity of government's being carried out on a resolution merely permission to continue. Well, back in 1889, you had the same type in Congress. They hadn't provided for a government, so the people had to organize a provisional government. Now it happens that Penn Wood is doing a series of biographies for Stanley Draper at Oklahoma Heritage. Stanley had tried to suck me into that, and I told him I would do 3, one of which was the biography of Angelo C. Scott, who was the least likely character you would pick in a boomtown like Oklahoma City on the night of April 22nd, 1889, to try to bring some order out of chaos. Dr. Scott, and I had the privilege of interviewing him in these later years, was a tall, angular, thin fella, and didn't look like anybody you'd find in a boom town. But as he wrote, he had that indispensable asset, a voice which carried, and that was one of the assets of Bill Murray, by the way. He had a voice which carried. So Dr. Scott was chairman. He presided over 2 mass meetings which set up committees to decide the lot contests and to reconcile the rival townsite plats that formed Oklahoma City. One of his friends said of him that he was the only man who could come out of a tent in the midst of an Oklahoma dust storm with a batwing collar and white tie and Prince Albert coat and be immaculately dressed, and that was a pretty apt description of him. But those were the conditions, and the people reckoned with it, and they had to set up some sort of provisional government. And so for 13 months they operated under a provisional government until May of 1890, when Congress passed the Organic Act, setting up a territorial government with a legislature and with officials appointed from Washington, the first governor being George W. Steele. Now here comes the first move to remove the capital from Guthrie. And if I had a map here so that I could show you those 6 central counties, I'd like to call your attention to what happened. In the council, which was equivalent to the territorial senate, were 13 members, 7 Republicans, 6 Democrats, and a populist from Stillwater by the name of George W. Gardenhauer. Now, of course, George Steele being a Republican, as was Benjamin Harrison, I suppose that the Republicans would organize both branches of legislature because they had a majority in both the House and the Council. But he failed to reckon with the ambitions of Oklahoma City, which led 2 senators from Oklahoma City to throw in with the Democrats and elect George W. Gardenhauer as president of the council. And over in the House, the same thing was taking place, and they elected a populist from El Reno, Ann Daniels, as Speaker of the House. Now Senate Bill, or Council Bill number 7, is introduced to move the capital from Guthrie to Oklahoma City. Now again, if I could show you those 6 counties, we would see what log rolling takes place, because George W. Gardenhauer gets A&M College. Look at those 6 counties and see where these institutions are located. Edmond gets the Normal School, now Central State University. Norman gets the university. And of course, Oklahoma City is going to get the capital. That was the play, and the bill went through. One of the sponsors in the House was Dan W. Peary from Oklahoma County. And Roy and I are fortunate, we're fortunate to be in our 60s, and unfortunate that we're in our 60s. But one of the good things was that I had the privilege as a young reporter to know many of the men who took part in these early struggles, including Dan W. Peary, who came to the Historical Society, succeeding Mr. Thoburn, J.B. Thoburn, under the Murray administration. So I got to know Dan Peary pretty well. Dan was one of the sponsors of that bill, and when it finally passed the House, there was such a turmoil. Guthrie was seething. The people were really out with a rope, and they were going to hang Dan. He fled through an open window, took refuge back of a big ice box in a meat market, and stayed there till after dark, when he finally made it to the room of C.G. Jones, old Gristmill Jones, who was in the house, and thus escaped being hanged. Governor Steele vetoed that bill, and that ended the attempt to move the capital at that time. Now, Dennis Flynn was elected as territorial delegate. He was the second one elected to go to Congress to represent the territory, and at that time Dennis Flynn was identified with Guthrie. So he writes into the appropriation bills, session after session, a proviso that the capital should remain in Guthrie and not be moved. Incidentally, he was the second delegate, and I would remind you, and some of you heard me the other day, that D.A. Harvey, for whom Harvey Avenue is named, was the first. About the only thing noteworthy he did that I know is to give the name to Harvey Avenue, and I doubt if that was even named during his lifetime. But nevertheless, we move along now until we get to the Enabling Act, which was passed in June 1906, providing for a constitutional convention to write a constitution for the proposed state of Sequoia. In the Enabling Act were a number of things that experienced legislators were amazed at. Among other things, it said that Oklahoma should have prohibition in the Indian Territory side for at least 21 years. It said that the capital should remain in Guthrie until 1913. When the delegates met in Convention Hall on November the 20th, or really it was November the 21st, 1906, to write the Constitution for the proposed state of Oklahoma, Henry Asp, who was one of the 12 Republicans, you remember the 12 apostles I referred to. Henry Asp was a prominent lawyer in Guthrie, representing the Santa Fe Railroad, but a very able man. He offers a resolution in the convention to nail the capital down in Guthrie until 1913. Now C.N. Haskell is beginning to feel his power, and Haskell says, Mr. Asp, we'll hear your resolution, but if you don't withdraw it, I'll move to table. Haven't we already accepted the Enabling Act? Didn't the Enabling Act say that the capital should remain in Guthrie until 1913? And Asp agreed that was so, and so the resolution was withdrawn, and there was no further action taken, and that proviso was not written into the Constitution, rather fortunately. Now we move along to November 16, 1907. Oklahoma becomes a state. Haskell's the first governor. He convenes the first legislature into session to set up housekeeping. There was lots of work to do, but Bill Murray, who had been president of the Constitutional Convention, was elected as speaker, and he touched on this capital question, advancing his idea that the state ought to obtain a township somewhere near the center of the state and develop its own city. He said if we would but condemn or purchase a township or more of land near the center of the state, lay out a town, the lots to be sold under proper business methods, the state to own the electric light plant, waterworks, streetcars, and all the public service institutions necessary to make the city, the sale of these lots would not only build the capital, but would pay for all these things together with all the institutions of the state. That was Bill Murray's idea, and it was pretty well accepted, but there was too much work to be done at that time for the legislature to go further with this problem until near the close of the session, and then the legislature finally passed House Joint Resolution number 11, proposing that the state acquire a site for the capital, embracing the apple grounds and lots to be sold for the benefit of the state. It went on the general election ballot on November the 3rd, 1908, receiving 117,441 yes votes to 75,792 negative votes. That may remind you that only men voted at that time, but here we see the first operation of the silent vote. For the delegates to the convention, and I wish I had my copy, a facsimile copy of the Constitution here, the delegates and the convention had deliberately gone back and written a provision into the section dealing with, or the article dealing with initiative and referendum, which provided that any questions submitted at a general election had to have a majority of all votes cast. I call that to your attention because now there's a movement on foot to repeal that section of the Constitution. last fall, the OEA, the Oklahoma Education Association, threatened to take it to the courts, and then I guess their lawyers had a second look and decided not to. Let me caution you against any change of the initiative and referendum that would do away with the silent vote. You would be amazed if you looked through the state directory and saw the half-baked and screwy ideas which have gone down the drain through the years thanks to the silent vote. And so I would caution you to be cautious with it. If the people aren't interested enough to make a change in their constitution, you better leave the status quo as it is until there's sufficient interest for them want to do that. All right, so the question has been shelved. It had a majority of the vote, which showed the thinking of the people, but it did not have the force of law. Now we move along and we find Oklahoma City is beginning to grow. In the special census of 1907 at statehood, Oklahoma City had a population of a little over 32,000. Guthrie had 12,000. In the short space of 3 years, between 1907 and 1910, when the next census was taken, Oklahoma City had doubled in size. Guthrie had gained 2, a net gain of 2 people in that period of time. A young man who will be 100 years old on next Monday was then business manager of the Daily Oklahoman, our former colleague of Roy's and mine, Mr. E.K. Gaylord. He was appointed chairman of a committee from the Chamber of Commerce to look into the proposition of drafting an initiative petition to locate the capital, amend the Constitution, provide for a permanent location, and submit a separate question. In the meantime, Oklahoma City had succeeded in landing one of the packing plants, and then the Morris plant first, and then the armor plant came along, and they were located, as you know, down there in Packingtown. Now, Haskell was a wheeler dealer, as I have told you, very resourceful. He had some friends, including I.M. Putnam, who had served in the territorial legislature, and who, by the way, is still living. And Putnam, of course, had lands out northwest, and he was ambitious to develop that as a capital area. Okay, under Mr. Gaylord's guidance and with the backing of the Chamber of Commerce, the initiative petitions were circulated, got the required signatures, and they were presented to Leo Meyer, who was the Assistant Secretary of State, on July the 21st, 1909. Now, it wouldn't take a very smart reporter to know that that was a pretty big story. In particular, that was a pretty big story in 1909, but there was nary a word in any of the papers until after the protest period had expired. And then on July the 27th, the Kansas City Journal broke the story, and the Oklahoma City Times gleefully charged to, quote, Guthrie sleeps on its rights. Guthrie citizens were in arms. They angrily charged a conspiracy to deprive them of the right of protest, and Judge Frank Dale and other leading citizens filed a mandamus action for a hearing alleging that the purpose in keeping the filing secret, quote, was to prevent the plaintiff and all other persons from filing objections to said petition within the 5 days allowed by law. Well, that was sort of a raw deal, and I don't know whether our friend had anything to do with it or not, but he was still business manager of a newspaper. But nevertheless, Guthrie finally did get its hearing, and Bill Cross, the Secretary of State, finally ruled that the signatures were sufficient, and the petitions went to the Attorney General in January of 1910 to prepare a ballot title. Now we move along to March the 28th, 1910, and the Attorney General has prepared his ballot title. And this is the amazing thing to me, because the most dramatic incident connected with the removal of the Capitol took place right in Charlie Haskell's office, and amazingly no reporter or nobody, no contemporary that I have ever found, ever took note of what happened. The petition, the election proclamation as prepared by the Attorney General provided that the election should be held on June the 14th, 1910. June the 14th was a Tuesday. That's when Oklahomans go to the polls. Now, if Haskell had sent this resolution back to the Attorney General to be retyped, I would never have known about it. But when I was doing research for the 46 Star, I looked at these original documents, and I had this one pulled, and there I was flabbergasted when I saw what Haskell had done. He had changed that election by striking out the 14th and substituting the 11th, thereby moving it from Tuesday to Saturday. Now, I had the good fortune to know Haskell the last couple of years of his life, and we hit it off very well. And in November of 1932, when Oklahoma was observing its 25th anniversary of statehood, I asked the former governor, if he was then living at Muskogee in the Turner Hotel, if he would dictate his story of the removal of the capital. I want to bring those letters with me tonight, but it would have, I located them. It would have taken a half hour to move things around to get them out of a filing cabinet, because I have two letters from Haskell in his own handwriting saying, yes, dear Hurst, yes, I'll be glad to accommodate. Dear Hurst, here it is. I tell you that because when I had the proofs for the 46 Star, it was in type, and I had the proofs in my car. One cold Saturday I was going up Broadway, and one of our newspaper friends was huffing and puffing his way up Broadway. So I stopped to offer him a ride, and he looked at those proofs, and he said, what are they? And I said, they're the proofs for a new history of early statehood. And I showed them to him, and I said, you know, one of the fortunate things is that I got Haskell to tell his story, the removal of the capital. Well, this friend of ours who thought he had a copyright on everything bearing the name Oklahoma sort of swelled up and said, well, I got him to do that. Sometime, if you're interested, I will show you those original letters. But with the passing years, I have come to know Haskell very intimately. I've had the good fortune of being close friends with his daughter, Frances. A couple of weeks ago, my wife and I were overnight guests of his granddaughter and her husband over at Wagner when I spoke to the Chamber of Commerce. But I learned Haskell, and I knew how he thought, and in digging back into his activities, I found that 20 years before, he was promoting a railroad in Ohio, and he couldn't get the right-of-way cleared through the little town of Ottawa. So he gets rail and ties and crews together on Saturday afternoon, and as soon as he saw the judge put on his hat and leave the courthouse, Haskell put the railroad through the town, and when the judge got back on Monday morning, the trains were running. Now, Haskell knew what was going to happen, but he wanted to give himself the weekend to play, and so he switched that election from Tuesday to Saturday, and yet, amazingly, nobody took note of it. Nobody asked a question. Why would you have an election on Saturday? Well, came that great Saturday. Of course, Oklahoma City was all enthusiastic. Shawnee was put in as a decoy to split Guthrie's vote, but my old friend General Charles F. Barrett was he headed the campaign for Shawnee, and of course Guthrie didn't know whether to go to court to attack it or whether to fight it at the polls, and so it didn't do either very effectively. But Oklahoma City really gotten high, and they sent out special trains and canvassed the state, and of course in the election they won overwhelmingly. Haskell incidentally voted for Shawnee, or at least he said he did. Haskell went to Muskogee to vote. On Saturday afternoon he came to Tulsa to speak at a banquet at the Tate Brady Hotel, and along about midnight he asked his friend Tate Brady to check on the results. Brady came back and said Oklahoma City's winning overwhelmingly. Haskell says, how can we get down there? Brady says, well, the last train is run. Haskell says, give me a phone. He gets on the phone, he calls Superintendent Frisco down to Sapulpa, get me a locomotive and a car, and that was a special train that he arranged. And now let me tell him that, let him tell the story. Then I told him call the division office of the Frisco. I think it was then at Sapulpa. In a very few minutes I had the superintendent's office on the telephone asking him to send the locomotive and coach at once to make an Oklahoma City trip. It took about 30 or 40 minutes. The special engine and the sleeping car were ready for us. I looked about and invited every Oklahoman in sight to make the trip, and a number went with us straight to Oklahoma City. That number included some who, and this is in 1932, who are still living. Bob Galbraith and his wife, Tate Brady and his wife, and several others. We all took this special train and went directly to Oklahoma City, reaching the Lee Hotel about 6 o'clock the morning of the 12th. The last thing before leaving Tulsa, I telephoned my then private secretary, W.B. Anthony. He says at Guthrie, actually, Anthony lived at Marlow at that time. He voted Marlow. He was in Oklahoma City. Haskell was a guy who didn't pay a great deal of attention to details, but he really painted with a bold brush. He said, "I've telephoned Anthony to get the Secretary of State with his seal and meet us at the Lee Huckins Hotel in Oklahoma City early in the morning. When we walked into the hotel, the whole crowd of us at 6 o'clock in the morning of the 12th, Bill Cross, Secretary of State, and Anthony were there waiting for us. We really had been visiting all night and had not been asleep, and everybody was hungry. They found a place for breakfast, and somebody said, 'Well, let's go in and get our breakfast.' I said, 'Just wait a minute.' I stepped up to the clerk's desk in the hotel, got a sheet of paper, the hotel letterhead, a pen and ink, and wrote the official proclamation based on the returns, which I thought were plainly adequate, declaring Oklahoma City the capital of the state of Oklahoma. I signed it as governor. Bill Cross put his official signature and seal on the proclamation, and complying with the law which said such proclamation should be posted in a public place, I posted it on the wall of the hotel adjoining the clerk's desk. Then I said, 'Very well, I'm ready to have breakfast in the state capitol.' That's Charlie Haskell for you." It was some hours later before the newspapers discovered and came extra. Okay, now let's see what happened on that midnight ride. These are the things that annoy me without end. I was telling this story not long ago, and I said, "Now, if your grandpappy, don't come up after the meeting and tell me confidentially that your grandpappy brought the Great Seal of the state down from Guthrie. If your grandpappy wasn't Bill Anthony, if he wasn't Luther Harrison, if he wasn't Bill Light, who drove the car, if he wasn't Spaulding, or if he wasn't S.F. Price, don't come and tell me that your grandpappy, and sure as hell it wasn't Ray McLean, I'll tell you, or George Calvert or anybody, and it certainly wasn't Jim Noble." I did a radio program for Ed Hardy on WKY a couple of years ago, and agreed to take answers, and I could tell from the mellow voice from East Town, "Well, what about Jim Noble?" I said Jim Noble didn't know anything about it until he saw the papers, and chances are he didn't have money enough to buy one. He had to wait for one, but somebody threw it away. He had nothing to do with it. But again, it was a dramatic incident that has given rise to all sorts of myths, and Haskell himself took note of this. He was rather philosophical about it, and I have been through most of the years, but I'm beginning to lose some of it. For he says that, well, let's see what he says about. At any rate, he said he never did like to spoil a good story in the middle of it. So he said he never did like to spoil a good story in the middle, and so he just listened in silence as they told these stories. Okay, now this is a surprising thing. Oklahoma City has campaigned vigorously for the capital, and it wakes up bleary-eyed Sunday morning on June the 12th, 1910, and discovers the capitol's there. And then it was in a most apologetic mood. In a front page editorial on the 14th, the Oklahoman said, they didn't have a Monday paper, by the way, and the 14th was the Tuesday when the election would have been if Haskell hadn't changed it. In a front page editorial, the Oklahoman said, in the contest for the location of the permanent seat of government of Oklahoma just closed, the Oklahoman represented and the people of Oklahoma City represented that this city was content to let the seat of government remain in Guthrie until 1913 as provided by the Enabling Act. The action of Governor Haskell, therefore, in proclaiming Oklahoma City the capital of the state and recognizing it as a capital comes as a distinct surprise to us. And so it was an embarrassing thing. But not only that, Oklahoma City had the problem of providing temporary offices for the governor and these state officials, and it had made no preparation. I am convinced from my research that Oklahoma City had campaigned honestly in the expectation that if it won the election, it would get the capital in 1913. But that was not the situation so far as Haskell was concerned. Haskell always stayed within the law, but he knew how far to go within the law, just as when he built the railroad through Ottawa. Now, there was a big celebration out at the fairgrounds on the Wednesday, on the 15th, And he says, and this ties in with the way that I had learned Haskell. There's a great gathering out there. He's called upon to speak, and he says, "It has never been the policy of the present governor of Oklahoma to let another man get to first base before he gets there himself. If there are to be any injunction suits, he proposes to let those suits find him where he wants to be, rather than at the place from which he is trying to get. And that is why the official seat of government for the state of Oklahoma today is Oklahoma City. I have but one regret in this matter, and that is that Bill Cross beat me to the new capital city, and I was not slow in getting here. Bill came 24 hours ahead of me to vote, and turning to Bill Cross, he says, how many times did you vote, Bill? When I got here at 6 o'clock, Bill was eating breakfast in what he then termed the new State House. Keep in mind that there's a matter of 22 years difference from the time he dictated the story to me and when he's speaking out to the fairgrounds. I'm glad to know, however, that Oklahoma City and its men who have made this vigorous campaign for the state capital hesitate to accept the capital at this time if they think they have gained it by deception. Your Chamber of Commerce, however, may rest in peace, for you haven't stolen anything. When I noticed before the election that Oklahoma City said that it didn't want the capital before 1913, I, in my address, that the law would take its course, stated that the law would take its course, and that your conception that the capital should not be moved before 1913 was wrong. I knew that the law would make immediate removal necessary, for the Constitution says the business of the state must be transacted at the state capital. I claim nothing for the part which I took in this capital fight. I merely took the part of the people of the state, and since I came to Oklahoma City, it is the first time in almost 3 years that my wife has quit wishing for my term of office to stop. In Guthrie, the Oklahoma State Capitol, which was a partisan Republican paper edited by Frank Weir, of course, had been carrying on a running feud with Haskell from the time he reached Guthrie to serve in the Constitutional Convention. And on one occasion, the leaders met with Frank Weir and tried to caution him to soft pedal his attacks, otherwise they might lose the capital. And so we see Haskell in this meeting at the fairgrounds giving some expression to that feeling. Well, okay, most of the state officers followed Haskell down here, but the Supreme Court was in a quandary. The judges decided to stay in Guthrie. And in time, of course, Guthrie prepared its appeal and took it to the state Supreme Court, and Oklahoma was getting ready to elect its third legislature in November, on November the 8th that year. Came the election, and a couple of days later, the Supreme Court ruled that the initiated petition was invalid. Why? Because it neglected to ask, shall it be adopted? On a little technicality, the Supreme Court had knocked out the election. Now notice how quickly Haskell meets the situation. His granddaughter Betty was born on October 26th. She was my hostess, or our hostess, a couple weeks ago, and I told Betty it would be pretty difficult for her to conceal her age, because it was a matter of public record that her grandfather had used her birth as an excuse to go to Guthrie. He told the newspaper men that he was going up there one Saturday to see his new granddaughter. She's born on October 26th, and she's a couple weeks old, so he goes to Guthrie, and he has lunch with Francis and Leslie Niblack, the parents. And then he strolls down to the courthouse, which was the temporary capital, and he issues a proclamation for the legislature to convene in Oklahoma City on November the 28th. I call your attention to the fact that under the Constitution it is possible for Governor Hall to convene the legislature in Tulsa or Muskogee or Enid, but if he were to do so, it would be necessary as a first business of the legislature to ratify that action. So the members of the third legislature came into Oklahoma City on November the 28th. They very quickly ratified the action. Bill Anthony, the guy who had really brought the Great Seal down from Guthrie, had been elected to the House, and he was chosen as Speaker. My old friend Dan Peary is back in the legislature, and notice this coincidence. The bill to remove the capital, to do the thing that the people had voted for, but which had been knocked out. The bill to move the capital was House Bill number 7. Now, under the provisions of the initiated petition, Governor Haskell had appointed a capital commission with his friend I.M. Putnam, one of the members. And everything was going lovely to build a capital out there at Putnam City. But in the meantime, the packing plants were in operation, and in those days we didn't have air conditioning. And that south breeze brought that odor up there, and people were, you remember how it used to be in Putnam City and Bethany. For years and years, they were stultified in their growth because of it. So, when the legislators get here, they take a dim view. They don't like this. They don't like this honeymoon between Haskell and Putnam for one thing, and they sure don't like that location for another. But if you ever wonder why 19th Street goes out to Portland Avenue and then angles off to 23rd and Meridian, if you would pursue that line on out, that would have been the streetcar line out to Putnam City, and I.M. Putnam said you could make it in 15 or 20 minutes on express cars.
Well, no, that's not true.
Okay, you come up and tell them what was true.
Okay, well,
Shut up, Wendell.
Well, you want to take exception?
it's going out to the last fruit farm, that's not true.
But it would have extended on out to Putnam City.
No, it's just going.
Shut up, Wendell. Let the man make his talk.
Okay, well, go right ahead.
Well, at any rate, legislature appoints its own committee with Senator Joe Thompson from down at Pauls Valley, and they finally select the location at 22nd and Lincoln Boulevard, where the Capitol is now located. It was necessary, of course, for Oklahoma City to raise the funds and provide the lands to reimburse the state for building the Capitol. And among other things, of course, Haskell wanted to recover the investments for Putnam and his associates. And so it was not until the latter part of December, on December the 29th, that all of these demands had been met. Then the governor with his friend, Judge W.A. Ledbetter from Ardmore, boarded a northbound Santa Fe train, went back to Guthrie, got off for a cup of coffee at the Harvey House, signed the bill, House Bill number 7, moving the Capitol, boarded a southbound train, and returned to Oklahoma City at 10:20 p.m. According to the papers, the whistle screeched, the bells rang, and the auto horns tooted, and the governor was met by a great reception committee and paraded to the Lee Huckins Hotel. After 20 years of struggle, Oklahoma City was definitely and finally the capital of Oklahoma.
Oklahoma. We have a very special program this evening in our two speakers, I feel. The first of our speakers is Mr. Irvin Hurst of Oklahoma City. He's had a unique career in several fields. He's worked in the area of insurance, news reporting for the Oklahoma Publishing Company. He's done historical research, has published a book which has sold well in the years since it appeared in 1957. A book, The 46th Star, which is concerned with the statehood process in Oklahoma. He has also distinguished himself in various areas of public service in Oklahoma City. He has served ably in an organization called, well, something like this, the Oklahoma City Improvement Committee or Commission, something of the kind, dating from the early 50s, and then also Mr. Draper could give us all the details on this as well, whatever it was. And then in addition, he served in a very great way when he worked with the Capitol Complex Improvement Authority. And in a sense, the beautiful and handsome development of the structures and landscaping of our Capitol complex, the roadways, and all of this was the brainchild of Mr. Irving Hurst. It's a very special privilege to present him this evening as he talks to us on the formation of the state of Oklahoma. Irving?
Well, you know, my first newspaper job was as a proofreader. And orally, I can't help but read proof when people introduce me as Irving because I immediately want to knock the G off of it. And then to set some of the other facts straight, I was on the City Planning Commission for nearly 5 years, 3 of those as chairman. And when the legislature created the Capital Improvement and Zoning Commission in 1953, I was selected as the only appointed member. And by virtue of the fact that I used to eat, drink, and sleep with members of the legislature, 4 of whom were on the commission, they turned it over to me, without pay I might add, to develop the master plan for the capital area. Well, so much for proofreading. I appreciate those fine remarks. I usually write my own introductions, and that way they don't get fouled up. Also, I'll hold them short. But I do appreciate the flattery that comes with them. It reminds me of the experience of an old maid teacher who was on the way home the other night, and as she went past a dark alley, a young fellow came out of the shadows and stuck a gat in her ribs and said, "Sorry, lady, this is a stick-up. Get your hands up." So she got her hands up, but she said, "Young man, but I have no money. Here, take my handbag. You can search it." So he searched it and had no money. He said, "I'm sure you got some on you. I'm going to have to frisk you." So he proceeded to frisk her. Again, he found no money. She said, "I told you I didn't have any money, but if you'll do it again, I'll give you a check." I reached the Capitol as a young reporter in 1929 in the days of the William J. Holloway administration. I was out there only for a short time on that occasion. I came in as assistant city editor of the Times for a year and a half, went back to the Capitol under the William H. Murray administration after the 1931 legislature, and off and on covered the Capitol and state politics for a good many years, with stints as city editor of the Times in the summer of 1935 and city editor of the Oklahoman in 1936, while the regular city editors went to Washington as correspondents, and then I was back at the Capitol. Those were rough days under Bill Murray. Our papers had opposed him in the 1930 campaign, and unfairly so. And the old man took it out on Otis Sultan and me and whoever else happened to be out there for the Oklahoman Times. I had hoped that Otis would be able to carry out the second part of this program tonight, and I'm sorry to learn that he's not going to be here. But as I say, those were trying days. I got kicked out of press conference 3 different times. I was tied with Lee Earhart of the Tulsa World with that score. But as the years went by, and I came to understand Bill Murray better, and he came to understand me better, we became rather fast friends. In 1949, when he reached his 80th birthday on November 21st, 1949, I was instrumental in setting up Squirrel Rifle Brigade No. 2 to put some money in the old man's pockets. While he was president of the Constitutional Convention, he had actually mortgaged his farm to help some of the poorer members of the convention stay in Guthrie. Now, he was repaid the $4,000 that he borrowed, but conveniently he had forgotten it. And so in 1949, we raised the money over again, $2,700. It was short, and he had some of that left when he died. Just coincidentally, and it wasn't done for that reason, the Squirrel Rifle Brigade campaign in November 1949 set the stage for Johnson Murray to run for governor in 1950. And of course, the very fact that he was old Bill's boy was enough to carry him on to victory. But let's go back a little bit. My invitations since I did the 46 Star have literally carried me from one corner of the state to another. Sometimes somebody say, do you know way to Podunk? Well, sure, I know the way to Podunk. I know every crossroads in Oklahoma. And I have spoken in most of them at some time or other, from Idabel to Boise City, from Miami to Frederick, from Ardmore to Ponca City. But I find as I get around the state now, I know this will be an exceptional group here, but I find as I get around the state, people have the haziest idea of what happened on April 22nd, 1889. Many of them, not you, but many of them think that the poor folks from all the other states, 45 of them, line the Kansas border and the Texas border and the Arkansas border and the South Texas border, and at noon on April 22nd, 1889, they dashed in here and established a state. Actually, I wonder if how many can tell me how large an area they did establish. How much of an area did we open on April 22nd, 1889 in terms of present-day counties? 6 of them. Well, I said this was an exceptional audience. I was speaking on Statehood Day up at Kingfisher, and I happened to mention the Organic Act. I said, you know, Congress then as now was somewhat careless. It had provided for the opening by attacking a rider on an Indian appropriation bill right at the end of Grover Cleveland's first administration. He either had to accept the rider or he had to veto the Indian appropriation bill, so he took what he felt was the lesser of two evils, approved the bill, and that dumped the whole matter of the opening into the hands of Benjamin Harrison, his successor, and Harrison, of course, by proclamation provided for the opening on April 22nd, 1889, but no provision had been made for a statutory government. The people would come in here and open these 6 counties, and that's exactly what they did, of course. By the way, you have any idea what day of the week April 22nd, 1889 came on? It was Monday, yes. Came on Monday. The Cherokee Outlet opening on September 16th, 1893 was on Saturday. I don't know why those little facts intrigue me, but I'm always curious about it. I wonder what they did on Sunday, you know. Well, of course, I know what most of them are doing. They were getting ready to make the run. Some of them, of course, were slipping across the line and were already in here when noon came. Well, at any rate, I was speaking to the high school kids over Kingfisher on Statehood Day, and I asked how many counties, and one little girl timidly held up her hand, and she said 7. And I said, 7? Where'd you get it? And she said, I got it from a textbook. So I read the textbook, and then I saw what had happened. Because it was 13 months after the opening before Congress gets around to passing the Organic Act, which provided for government for the Oklahoma Territory. And to these 6 counties, it added what? The Panhandle area, which was Beaver County, and that made 7. By the way, I wonder how many of you know why the Panhandle sticks out like a sore finger out there. Any of you ever read about the Missouri Compromise? Anybody ever follow a line from the southwest border of the Panhandle clear across? Can you imagine Texas giving up anything today to Oklahoma? But back when Texas came into the state as a union, in order to have slavery, they gave up the Panhandle countries. And you follow that line, what is it, 3620 or whatever that parallel is. Well, okay. But almost from the time of the opening, and incidentally, I have done an article for Orbit, which I hope will appear on April 21st, on the horses in the run. I was always fascinated with the horses in the run, and you'd be interested in some that attained some distinction because they had sentimental owners. But almost from the start of the run, I mean almost from the first opening, the people began to agitate for statehood. And they wanted either Oklahoma Territory and Indian Territory, but they either wanted one state or 2 states. They wanted statehood. So they held numerous conventions and sent numerous delegations to Washington to petition for statehood, and nothing came of it. And then an unusual man enters the picture, and that's C.N. Haskell from Ohio, born in March, by the way, 1863. Give you some idea, he'd be 111 years old if living now. C.N. Haskell was a remarkable young fella, studied law, became a railroad promoter in a day when railroad promoters might not have been too honest, but he knew how to make a fast buck. By the turn of the century, Haskell was affluent enough that he had his own railroad car, private car, and he'd take his family to San Antonio for the winter, and down in his private car, and sometimes he'd bring the car back, and sometimes he wouldn't. On one of those return trips, he met Judge Thomas from over at Muskogee, the father of Carolyn Grant, Carolyn Foreman. foreman. And Judge Thomas invited him to stop off in Muskogee, and our first mention of C.N. Haskell in the Oklahoma papers is when the Commercial Club gave a dinner for him in Muskogee in April 1901. He decided to cast his lot with this new country, so he moved his family not to Muskogee but to Fayetteville because the housing conditions were better there, and he began to promote railroads. He built the railroad from Fayetteville to Muskogee. He built the Midland Valley from Muskogee up through Pawhuska and on into Wichita. He built the K.O.N.G. In fact, it was said of Haskell they built everything in Muskogee that ran on wheels except the MK&T, and it was already operating when he got there. Now, by 1905, in a matter of 4 years, Haskell had enough prestige that he could prevail on his friend Pleasant Porter, the principal chief of the Creeks, and the leaders of the other 5 civilized tribes, to call a statehood convention to write a constitution for the proposed state of Sequoia. Keep in mind, with the Indian removal in the 1830s and 40s, the Indians had been promised a state of their own, and they still clung to the hope that they would have a state of their own. Now, I think Haskell was practical enough to know that there weren't going to be 2 states, but the best way to convince the Indians of that was to let them try. So Pleasant Porter called this convention, which met in Muskogee in August of 1905, and it brought together a remarkable group of political leaders from the Indian Territory side of Oklahoma. And incidentally, that was not just eastern Oklahoma, but it was southern part of Oklahoma. If you went straight south from here, you would run into the Chickasaw country, for example. They met in Muskogee, and among those, of course, was William H. Murray, W.W. Hastings, and Haskell was a vice president. Pleasant Porter was president of the convention, but turned it over to Haskell. And they drafted a constitution for the proposed state of Sequoia, which was submitted to the voters and approved. And now another delegation goes to Washington to ask for statehood. Theodore Roosevelt was in the White House. He wasn't very pleased with this group, and I don't know what his exact words were, but in effect he said, don't be silly, we aren't going to have 2 states but 1. But it did give an impetus, the Sequoia Convention, gave an impetus to the movement for statehood for Oklahoma. And thus Congress on June the 14th, 1906, passed the Enabling Act, providing for a constitutional convention of 112 members, 55 from Indian Territory, 55 from Oklahoma Territory, and 2 from the Osage Country, to meet at Guthrie on November the 20th, 1906. Now down at Tishomingo, Bill Murray, was, of course, was a candidate. Haskell was a candidate. Bob Williams was a candidate. Hastings didn't run. Down at Tishomingo, Murray's checking over these results, and he notices that there were 34 members of the Sequoia Convention elected, and in addition, 30 members of the Farmers Union in which he was active. So he sat down, he wrote Haskell, and he said, you will observe those marked with an S means Sequoia. Those marked F means Farmers Union, 64 in number. Do you know a man in western Oklahoma that would be fitted for the presidency? Well, I find as the years go by that Bill Murray's jokes fall rather flat and people don't know what I'm talking about. But I think Stanley will appreciate the fact that if Murray had one outstanding trait, it was modesty. And but if Haskell couldn't think of a man who was fitted for the presidency, Bill Murray could think of one. Well, Haskell gets the idea all right. So he puts through a long-distance call to Bill Murray down at Tishomingo and invites him to come up to Muskogee. Murray went up, and there in a little caucus with Haskell and Robert L. Owen, who became one of our first U.S. senators, they decide that Bill Murray is the logical man for president of the convention. Now, Haskell had bigger fish to fry, for one thing. Murray was particularly well adapted for the job. Haskell says, I'll go over to Guthrie a few days early and lay the groundwork, and then you come along. And that was characteristic of the Times, and this is Times with a small t, that an item from Tishomingo Indian Territory appeared in the Guthrie Leader. And by the way, the papers were very partisan in those days. The state capital was a partisan Republican paper. The Leader was a partisan Democratic paper. So this item appeared on November 16, 1906. Now, it's just a coincidence that it's November 16. It reported a resolution by a, quote, Democratic mass meeting, close quote, on November 14, endorsing William H. Murray for president of the convention. Murray was described as, quote, a good parliamentarian, an impartial arbiter, a well-prepared constitutional lawyer, a politician too wise and too honorable to barter away his position by political promises, trades, or intrigues. When I ran across that item as I was doing research for the 46 Star, I thought it had a characteristic ring because by that time, of course, I had known Bill Murray for a number of years and I knew his style. But as I read that the 3-volume memoirs and true history, I saw that the old man modestly admitted that he wrote it himself. Well, Murray was elected president of the Constitutional Convention, and after I did the 46 Star, my old friend Henry S. Johnson, who was the temporary president of the convention, latched on to me, and if you ever had to babysit with a 90-year-old ex-governor, you will know what I had on my hands for a good many years. The dear old man would catch the Santa Fe and come down from Perry, and I didn't know he was coming. I'd come to office at noon, and there he was sitting waiting for me. Because the 46 Star restored him to some of the glory of that day of November 20, 1906. The convention met in Brooks Opera House. I regret to say the building has been torn down in recent years, but the Brooks Opera House was adjoining the Royal Hotel, and the Royal Hotel was the political and social center of Oklahoma Territory. The Ione Hotel had not yet been constructed, and the Brooks Opera House was a cavern-like thing. When I visited it, you go through a beer joint to get into it, and then it's opened up, and that was where they put on the plays. So great was the demand for tickets that the delegates were limited to 2 tickets each. And Francis Haskell, who's a dear friend of mine, snorts at the idea that people wore cowboy boots or blue jeans or anything like that in those days. When they went to formal affairs, they dressed up. And so even from this western country, they dressed up for this formal opening at 2 o'clock. After the election of Murray, he read his inaugural address, and that was unusual for Bill Murray because usually he spoke extemporaneously. But keep in mind that on November 20, 1906, that's just the day before Bill Murray is going to be 37 years old. He still thinks of himself as 36, so he's quite a young man. We are now united, he said, not as 2 territories, but as Greater Oklahoma. And I find it interesting as I go back and forth because the people are not conscious that they are in Oklahoma Territory, Indian Territory. For example, when I'm speaking in eastern Oklahoma, they're more conscious that that was Indian Territory than they are here. But in 1906, these delegates who came to Guthrie were most conscious of the fact that they represented 2 diverse territories. So he said in a prophetic vein, "First let us make a constitution without the sting of partisanry, because the conditions of today may be reversed tomorrow, and you may thus have to take the same dose yourself that you dosed out to your fellow citizens." Now notice this. Years before Henry Bellman's on the scene, in fact before Henry Bellman is born, Bill Murray is saying to partisan Democrats, watch out, don't be partisan. You may have to take the same dose tomorrow that you're dishing out today. He said relative to education, the provisions of education should be liberal and as near nonpartisan as possible. A measure of vast importance will be to provide every possible means to promote homeowning in this country, and so on. Now the next evil. We must provide in the Constitution, and by the way, I have brought a facsimile copy of it with me tonight. We must provide in the Constitution that no public service corporation shall own any more land than that which shall be necessary to operate its business. That was the forerunner of this cheap provision, which said to a public service corporation like the OG&E, Southwestern Bell, Oklahoma Natural, you can't buy this farm and hold it. You can only buy land that you need in your business, and if you attempt to hold other lands, the state will eschew to take them away from you. Relative to labor, now I want you to notice how conditions have changed in these 60-some-odd years. Relative to labor, Murray proposed an 8-hour day, and any agreement between employee and employer, exempting the latter from damages for death or injury, should be declared null and void. We think that's just plain fairness today. But in 1906, I hate to tell you, it was not uncommon for a man, if he went to get a job at the ice plant or with the railroad or someplace else, to be forced to sign an agreement that if he got hurt, he wouldn't sue his employer. Sure, the rest of the nation looked on as the Constitutional Convention met in Guthrie, because this was a bunch of wild-eyed radicals who were really writing something novel in the way of a constitution. For example, an 8-hour day and any agreement exempting the employer for death or injury would be null and void. How far the state has progressed in race relations is revealed in Murray's suggestion for a government attitude towards the Negroes. Now, as they met in Guthrie, of course, Logan County had attracted a heavy black population. And most of the leaders in the convention were for the Jim Crow law. Yes, sir, I'm for the Jim Crow law. But it was all Murray and Haskell could do, especially Haskell, to keep them from writing it into the Constitution. The reason I'll tell you later. But, so, the clamor for the Jim Crow provisions requiring separate railroad coach and waiting room facilities was loud among the delegates. After endorsing this suggestion, Bill Murray added, "We have no desire to do the Negro an injustice. We shall protect him in his real rights. We must provide the means for the advancement of the Negro race and accept him as God that gave him to us and use him for the good of society. He must be taught in the line of his own sphere as porters, bootblacks, and barbers, and many lines of agriculture, horticulture, and mechanics in which he is adept. But it is an entirely false notion that the Negro can rise to the equal of the white man in the professions or become an equal citizen to grapple with public questions." And the Brooks Opera House rang with applause from those words. Now, it's rather significant that when old Bill got around to writing his memoirs and true history of Oklahoma some years after he retired from the governorship, and the situation had changed, and Johnson was eyeing the governorship, that he omitted this part of his speech from those memoirs. If I had not gone back to the record, I would not have known about this paragraph. And incidentally, I had a visit from a Negro leader from the east side one day, and while we were talking about a zoning problem, I received a telephone call, and he was looking at the books on my desk, and there was Bill Murray's book called "The Negro's Place and Call of Race," and he reached out and got it, and he was looking at it, and he said, "May I borrow it?" And I've not got that book back yet. The president also touched on the free pass evil of the day. And would you believe it, in 1906, Guthrie was served by 9 railroads with 42 daily passenger trains, and anybody who was anybody, and that means preacher, county official, city official, had a pass, free pass, and many of the delegates had come to Guthrie on free passes. But the railroads had so dominated and corrupted the legislatures in the older states that the reaction had set in. So Bill Murray touched on the free pass evil of the day, suggesting a provision which was later incorporated in the oath for office. Referring to passes as the cheapest form of bribery, he declared, "We should say to every public officer that if he rides a free pass, he will also ride in stripes to the penitentiary." And those who had come on free passes were those who applauded the loudest. Well, it was written into the oath of office, and if you will recall, a few years ago, we did amend the oath, but prior to that, one of my friends on the Corporation Commission was forced out of office on this, on grounds similar to this. Bill Murray declared for the initiative and referendum, then a radical idea in operation in Switzerland and already adopted by the state of Oregon. And this is what he had to say. The only argument ever offered against this system is that the people are not conservative, while the history of the optional power is that the people are more conservative than reform leaders. Summing up his recommendations, Murray concluded, can you imagine Bill Murray quoting poetry? Concluded with his hope for the organic law for the future state of Oklahoma, that her fair form may stand and shine, make bright our days and light our dreams, turning to scorn with lips divine the falsehood of extremes. I want to say, while we're talking about the initiative and referendum, again, I'm fortunate to have an informed audience. I wonder if you know the difference between the initiative and the referendum. In a study by the Legislative Council in 1956, and I regret it hasn't been brought down to date, it was found that since statehood, from 1907 to 1956, there were 117 propositions submitted as proposed constitutional amendments. 36 were initiated petitions presented by the people, and 81 were legislative referenda presented by the legislature. Altogether, the voters have approved 41 propositions, or 35% of the 117 submissions. Consequently, on a percentage basis, 65% have been rejected. Moreover, of the 36 initiated proposals submitted, 12 or 33% have been approved, and 24 or 67% have been rejected. So the record would more or less bear Bill Murray out that the people were more conservative. Now, what is the difference? On an initiative, the people have the right to initiate a measure, either a constitutional amendment or a proposed statute. A referendum can be one of two things. It can be a question submitted by the legislature, or it can be a bill which fails to get the two-thirds majority of both houses for the emergency clause, and which therefore is subject to attack by referendum petition in the 90 days after the session adjourns. During those 90 days, if sufficient signatures are obtained, then that question is stayed until it is submitted to a vote of the people. My observation is that, as Bill Murray said, the people are more conservative than the legislative leaders. But let me say one word about the silent vote, and then we'll move on into the Constitutional Convention, because we've got to carve this state into counties and get along with the show. My dear friends in the League of Women Voters are urging that we amend the Constitution to eliminate the silent vote. I wish I had brought a state directory here to show you some of the questions which had failed, thank God, because of the silent vote. And as a political writer and one who has been interested in public affairs ever since I was knee-high to a duck, I would say that if the people are not sufficiently interested or informed to vote on a question, better reject it than to adopt it. If there isn't sufficient interest, if they aren't sufficiently informed, many disastrous measures have gone down the drain because they were killed in the silent vote in general elections. Well, okay, now we have opened the convention, and the next day we're going to meet in the City Hall at Guthrie. That's November 21st, 1906. Bill Murray's being congratulated on his 37th birthday. And we'll get down to writing the Constitution. But first, we've got to divide this state into counties. The Enabling Act didn't do that. Now, over on the Oklahoma Territory side, the counties have been pretty well defined with the successive openings. With the original unassigned lands, the Sac and Fox, the Cherokee Outlet, the Kiowa Comanche Big Lottery, the Cheyenne Arapaho Run, and like counties had been pretty well defined, but over in Indian Territory side there weren't any counties. There were court recording districts, so it was necessary to divide the state into counties. Now the Congress had provided $100,000 for this constitutional convention, but Bill Murray and Haskell saw that if they didn't get this county boundary question settled, the $100,000 would be gone and the Constitution was written. Now when Haskell got to Guthrie a few days before the convention and went up to the desk in the Royal Hotel to register, the clerk said, "Sorry, Mr. Haskell, aren't any rooms left." And Haskell said, "How come?" And said, "All taken by the delegates." So Haskell looks at the register and he says, "Hell, these aren't delegates, they're lobbyists." And I've told this story so many times, so Stanley, I guess you'll appreciate it. Every little Stanley Draper from every little crossroads was in Guthrie trying to get a county seat for his town, see? And they had taken the rooms. Well, Mr. Brooks made the accommodations for Haskell, and he finally got registered. One of his first resolutions offered in convention was to put a curb on the lobbyists. However, I don't think it's been effective up to this day. So now the convention gets down to this all-serious question of carving the state into counties. Well, in no time, the County Boundary Committee got bogged down. There was a good guy from down at Duncan. He was a grocer who was chairman of it, but he couldn't cope with the situation. And Haskell and Murray hit upon the strategy that they would go to a weak sister on the committee and they'd say, "Look, if we give you a county, you can carve it out just the way you please. Will you resign from the committee? And he said yes. So they gave him Ottawa County, and he resigned. If you want to know who it was, you'd have to look through the director here to find it. He resigned from the committee. Murray as president, then put Haskell on. Murray as president is an ex officio member, and working day and night, they carved this state into 75 counties. No, you're going to tell me there's 77 counties, and I'd remind you we've added 3 since statehood. But one of them was knocked out. Now they come up just before the recess for Christmas to adopt the county boundary question. And you will find the counties, of course, that's one reason the Constitution is so voluminous. You'll find them set forth in detail there in the Constitution. Henry S. Johnson took a handful of notes and stood before that convention and read those county boundaries. And they finally drove. On one occasion during this very tense period in the convention, Uncle Sam Rogers, who by the way was old as well, at 60, I'm 69.